My name is Esperanza Valdez, but everyone calls me Ezra. I never thought a simple sip of water would become the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge I have ever executed. But here we are. It was July in Colorado Springs, and the heat was absolutely merciless. The kind of heat that makes your uniform stick to your skin like a second layer, the kind that turns your helmet into a personal sauna, and the kind that makes you question every life choice that led you to standing outside in full gear for 8 hours straight. I had been working security at Fort Carson for about 6 months, and I genuinely loved the job. There was something deeply satisfying about being the first line of defense, about knowing that every single person who entered our base had to pass through me first. I took pride in my work, in my crisp uniform, in my thorough ID checks, and in the respect I had earned from both my fellow soldiers and the officers who passed through my gate daily. But that day, everything changed because of Lieutenant Morrison. Lieutenant Morrison was one of those officers who seemed to believe that making life difficult for enlisted personnel was somehow a mark of strong leadership. He was maybe 30 years old, fresh out of officer candidate school, and carrying himself like he had personally won every major military conflict in American history. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his uniform always immaculate, and his attitude always insufferable. He had this way of looking at you like you were some kind of insect that had crawled into his field of vision, and he spoke to enlisted soldiers like we were barely capable of tying our own boots. The heat index that day was climbing toward 110 degrees. I am not exaggerating when I say that the asphalt was literally shimmering with heat waves, and I could feel the metal of my equipment burning through my gloves. My shift started at 12:45 in the afternoon, right when the sun was at its most brutal. I had been on duty for maybe 20 minutes when Lieutenant Morrison appeared at my gate like some kind of heat-induced hallucination. He strutted over to my position with that characteristic swagger of his uniform somehow still looking fresh despite the oppressive temperature. I straightened up and gave him the respect his rank demanded, even though every fiber of my being wanted to tell him to find some shade and leave me alone. But what he said next made my blood boil even hotter than the Colorado sun. "Valdez," he said, his voice carrying that condescending tone that had become his trademark. "I need to make something crystal clear to you and the other gate guards. You are not to drink water in plain sight of incoming traffic. If you need to hydrate, you can do so in the guardhouse or in one of the side buildings, but not out here where everyone can see you. We need to maintain a professional appearance at all times." I stared at him for a moment, convinced that I had somehow misheard him. The heat was already making me feel lightheaded. My mouth was dry as sandpaper, and my water bottle was calling to me like a siren song. But surely he could not be serious about prohibiting water consumption during what was essentially a medical emergency-level heat wave. "Sir," I said carefully, "with respect, the heat index is approaching dangerous levels. Staying hydrated is not just important for performance. It is literally a matter of safety. I can be professional while also taking care of my health." His face immediately darkened, and I could see that familiar vein in his forehead start to throb. Lieutenant Morrison did not like being questioned, and he especially did not like being questioned by someone he considered beneath him in every possible way. "Did I stutter, Valdez?" he snapped. "I gave you a direct order. You will not drink water where incoming personnel can see you doing it. Period. End of discussion. If you have a problem with following orders, maybe you need to reconsider your career in the military." I felt my jaw clench, but I knew better than to push back any further. In the military, you learn to pick your battles, and this was clearly not one I was going to win through direct confrontation. So I nodded, gave him the appropriate response, and watched him walk away with that satisfied smirk that told me he thought he had just put me firmly in my place. But Lieutenant Morrison had made a critical error in judgment. He had assumed that I would simply comply with his unreasonable order and suffer in silence. He had underestimated my creativity, my determination, and my absolute refusal to be treated like garbage by someone who thought his rank gave him the right to endanger my health for the sake of appearances. The first part of my plan was simple: malicious compliance. If Lieutenant Morrison wanted me to drink water out of sight, then I would drink water out of sight, but I would do it in the most inconvenient and disruptive way possible. About 30 minutes after his visit, I saw a black sedan approaching my gate. As it got closer, I could see that it contained 4 full bird kernels, which meant this was definitely not a routine entry. These were high-ranking officers, the kind of people who could make or break careers with a single phone call. The driver was Colonel Patricia Hayes, someone I recognized as the Deputy Commanding General of the base. I approached the vehicle with my usual professionalism, collected all 4 identification cards, and then made a show of examining them carefully. But instead of processing them immediately like I normally would, I looked at Colonel Hayes and said something that would change everything. "Ma'am, I need to step into the guardhouse for a moment to verify these credentials. I will be right back with you." Colonel Hayes looked slightly confused, but nodded. I could see the other colonels in the car checking their watches and exchanging glances, clearly wondering what could possibly require me to leave my post for what should have been a routine ID check. I walked into the guardhouse, taking my time, and made a big show of taking a long, satisfying drink from my water bottle. I could see the colonels through the window, and I could tell they were getting impatient. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, I walked back to their vehicle. Colonel Hayes rolled down her window and asked the question I had been hoping for. "Specialist Valdez, what exactly was that all about? Why did you need to leave your post to check our identification?" I straightened up and gave her my most professional expression. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Morrison has ordered all gate guards not to drink water in plain sight of incoming traffic. Since I was getting dehydrated in this heat, I needed to step away to hydrate properly. I kept your identification cards to ensure you would not attempt to run the gate while I was indisposed." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Colonel Hayes processing what I had just told her, and the expression on her face was shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked very much like controlled fury. The other colonels in the car were leaning forward, clearly trying to hear every word of our conversation. "Did you just say that Lieutenant Morrison ordered you not to drink water in plain sight?" Colonel Hayes asked, her voice very carefully controlled. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. His exact words were that we need to maintain a professional appearance at all times, and that if we need to hydrate, we should do so in the guardhouse or in one of the side buildings. He was very clear that this was a direct order. Colonel Hayes exchanged looks with the other officers in her car, and I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. These were experienced military leaders who understood the importance of troop welfare, and they clearly recognized that what Lieutenant Morrison had done was not just stupid, it was potentially dangerous. "Specialist Valdez," Colonel Hayes said, "please process our credentials and allow us to proceed. And please continue to stay hydrated as needed. That is an order from me personally." I processed their IDs quickly and efficiently, and watched as they drove through the gate. But I knew that this was not the end of the story. Colonel Hayes had that look in her eyes that told me Lieutenant Morrison was about to have a very bad day. I was absolutely right. About 20 minutes later, I saw Lieutenant Morrison's jeep speeding toward my gate like he was being chased by enemy forces. He screeched to a halt next to my position, and I could see that his usually perfect appearance was looking decidedly disheveled. His face was red, whether from heat or embarrassment I could not tell, and he was clearly agitated. "Valdez," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "there has been a change in policy. You and all other gate guards are now authorized to drink water as needed, regardless of who might be observing. This change is effective immediately." I nodded professionally and thanked him for the update, but I could tell he was not finished. He sat there for a moment, clearly wanting to say more, but apparently unable to find the words. Finally, he drove off without another word, leaving me standing there with what I am sure was a barely concealed smile on my face. But my revenge was far from complete. Over the next few weeks, I made sure to drink water very visibly whenever Lieutenant Morrison was in the area. I would take long, slow sips from my water bottle, making sure he could see exactly what I was doing. I would comment to other soldiers about how important it was to stay hydrated, especially when working in extreme heat conditions, and I made sure to thank him publicly for his concern about our health and safety. The beauty of my revenge was that Lieutenant Morrison could not say a word about it. He had been forced to rescind his ridiculous order, and now he had to watch as I did exactly what he had originally forbidden me to do. Every time he saw me drinking water, he was reminded of his humiliation at the hands of Colonel Hayes and the other senior officers, who had clearly made their displeasure known. But the real satisfaction came from watching Lieutenant Morrison's behavior change over the following months. Word had clearly gotten around about his water prohibition order, and it had not done his reputation any favors. I started noticing that other officers were treating him with less respect, that his suggestions in meetings were being ignored or dismissed, and that he was being excluded from important decisions and briefings. The military is a small community, and news travels fast. Soon everyone knew about the lieutenant who had tried to prevent his soldiers from drinking water during a dangerous heat wave, and about how he had been humiliated by a specialist who had used his own stupid rule against him. His career trajectory, which had probably been pointing upward before our encounter, suddenly seemed to have stalled. I heard through the grapevine that Lieutenant Morrison had been called into several meetings with senior leadership, and that he had been strongly counseled about the importance of troop welfare and the dangers of prioritizing appearance over safety. I also heard that he had been assigned to some less desirable duties, the kind of assignments that are typically reserved for officers who need to prove themselves all over again. The most satisfying moment came about 3 months later, when I was promoted to sergeant. The promotion ceremony was held in front of the entire company, and I could see Lieutenant Morrison standing in the back, clearly uncomfortable, but required to attend. As I received my new stripes, I made sure to look directly at him and give him a small, professional nod of acknowledgement. After the ceremony, several of my fellow soldiers came up to congratulate me, and more than one of them mentioned how much they respected the way I had handled the water situation. They told me that my actions had not only protected my own health and safety, but had also protected theirs by forcing a change in an unreasonable and dangerous policy. But perhaps the most meaningful compliment came from Colonel Hayes herself. She approached me after the ceremony and shook my hand, telling me that she respected soldiers who were willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or potentially risky. She said that the military needed more people like me, people who understood that true professionalism sometimes meant challenging authority when that authority was wrong. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that my revenge was not really about getting back at Lieutenant Morrison for being a petty tyrant. It was about something much more important than that. It was about standing up for the principle that soldiers deserve to be treated with basic human dignity, and that no one should have to choose between following orders and protecting their own health and safety. Lieutenant Morrison taught me an important lesson that day, though I doubt it was the lesson he intended to teach. He showed me that sometimes the most effective form of resistance is not direct confrontation, but rather the careful and strategic use of an opponent's own rules and assumptions against them. He gave me the tools for my own revenge by creating a situation that was so obviously unreasonable that it could not survive contact with higher authority. In the end, my revenge was complete, not because I had destroyed Lieutenant Morrison's career, but because I had forced him to confront the consequences of his own poor judgment. He had tried to use his authority to make my life more difficult, and instead, he had made his own life more difficult. He had tried to demonstrate his power over me, and instead he had demonstrated his own incompetence to everyone who mattered. The heat wave eventually passed, but the lessons I learned from that experience have stayed with me throughout my military career. I learned that sometimes the best way to fight an unjust system is to use that system's own rules against it. I learned that quiet, strategic resistance can be more effective than loud, direct confrontation. And I learned that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply watching your opponent defeat themselves through their own arrogance and stupidity. Today, I am a senior non-commissioned officer with my own soldiers to lead and protect. And I make sure that every single one of them knows that their health and safety will always come first, regardless of what anyone else might think about appearances or protocol. Because I learned firsthand that true leadership means taking care of your people, not using your authority to make their lives more difficult. Lieutenant Morrison may have thought he was teaching me a lesson about following orders and maintaining discipline, but what he actually taught me was something far more valuable, that the best revenge is not just getting even, but making sure that the person who wronged you learned something important about themselves in the process. And judging by the changes in his behavior and career trajectory, I think Lieutenant Morrison learned that lesson very well indeed.